Sarah had always been different from other girls in her small Montana town. While her friends painted their nails and talked about boys, she spent her afternoons in the woods behind her grandfather's ranch, learning to track deer and shoot tin cans off fence posts. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran named Jack, had taught her everything he knew about marksmanship from the time she could hold a rifle steady. "Breathe in, hold it, squeeze slow," Jack would say, his weathered hands guiding her small fingers on the trigger. "The rifle is just a tool, Sarah. The real weapon is your mind." By the time Sarah turned 18, she could hit a playing card at 200 yards with her grandfather's old wooden stock Winchester. The rifle was nothing special to look at. Its dark walnut stock was scratched and worn from decades of use, and the metal had lost its shine long ago. But in Sarah's hands, it was deadly accurate. After high school, Sarah moved to Denver to study engineering at the university. She kept her shooting skills sharp at local ranges, but city life felt strange after growing up in the mountains. The concrete and noise made her feel trapped. She missed the quiet focus of the woods, the challenge of making impossible shots. One evening while browsing social media, Sarah came across a video that changed everything. It showed a group of Navy SEALs conducting a long-range shooting demonstration at a military base. The camera focused on their expensive equipment, high-tech rifles with advanced scopes, custom ammunition, and sophisticated range-finding devices. The announcer explained how these elite soldiers were among the best marksmen in the world. "These SEALs can hit targets at distances most people can't even see," the narrator said proudly. "Their training and equipment represent the pinnacle of military precision shooting." Sarah watched as the SEALs took turns firing at targets placed at various distances. She noticed their confident posture, their expensive gear, and the way they casually discussed wind speed and bullet drop. They looked impressive, but something about their shooting technique bothered her. They relied heavily on their technology, letting computers calculate everything for them. In the comments section, people praised the SEALs endlessly. "No one could challenge these guys," one person wrote. "They're superhuman," said another. The more Sarah read, the more frustrated she became. She had grown up learning that marksmanship was about understanding nature, reading the environment, and connecting with your weapon. These soldiers seemed to treat shooting like a video game. That night, Sarah called her grandfather. "Jack, I saw something today that really got under my skin," she said, telling him about the SEAL demonstration. Jack listened quietly, then chuckled. "You know, sweetheart, in Vietnam we didn't have all those fancy gadgets. We had iron sights and instinct. Some of the best shots I ever saw were country boys with beat-up rifles and years of hunting experience. Technology is useful, but it can also make you soft." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "When you depend on machines to do your thinking, you lose the ability to adapt. Real shooting isn't about having the best equipment. It's about understanding your weapon so well that it becomes part of you. It's about reading conditions that no computer can calculate." Sarah spent the next few weeks thinking about her grandfather's words. She couldn't stop watching videos of military marksmen, analyzing their techniques and comparing them to what she had learned. She noticed that many of them struggled when their equipment failed or when conditions weren't perfect. They had been trained to rely on technology rather than develop natural instincts. The more she researched, the more confident she became that her old-fashioned approach might actually be superior. She had learned to judge wind by feeling it on her skin, to estimate distance by studying shadows and terrain, and to control her breathing through pure mental discipline. These were skills that couldn't be taught in a classroom or programmed into a computer. During spring break, Sarah returned to Montana with a crazy idea forming in her mind. She spent a week in the mountains with her grandfather, pushing her shooting skills to new limits. They practiced at longer and longer ranges, using only the iron sights on the old Winchester. Sarah discovered she could consistently hit targets at distances that would challenge even professional snipers. "You've got something special, Sarah," Jack said one afternoon as they packed up their gear. "You understand the rifle like it's alive. That's not something you can buy in a store." Back in Denver, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to online communities where military and civilian marksmen gathered. She read discussions about record shots, famous snipers, and legendary firearms. The Navy SEALs seemed to be regarded as untouchable masters of long-range shooting. One day, Sarah discovered that a group of SEALs would be conducting a public demonstration at a shooting competition in Colorado. They were scheduled to show off their skills and interact with civilian marksmen. The event was being promoted as a chance for ordinary shooters to learn from the best. As Sarah read the details, an audacious thought crossed her mind. What if she attended the event? What if she actually challenged these elite soldiers to a shooting contest? The idea seemed ridiculous at first, but the more she considered it, the more appealing it became. She imagined walking up to these confident warriors with her grandfather's old rifle and asking, "Can I give it a shot?" She pictured their surprised faces when they saw her worn equipment and heard her polite request to compete. They would probably laugh, thinking she was just another civilian who didn't understand what real marksmanship required. But Sarah knew something they didn't. She had spent years developing skills that couldn't be bought or programmed. She understood her rifle in ways that went beyond technical specifications. And most importantly, she had nothing to prove to anyone except herself. The shooting competition was still 3 months away, which gave Sarah time to prepare. She began training more seriously than ever before, traveling to remote locations where she could practice at extreme ranges without disturbing anyone. She studied wind patterns, learned about atmospheric conditions, and pushed herself to make shots that seemed impossible. Her grandfather became her training partner, sharing stories from his military service and teaching her techniques that weren't found in any manual. "The secret," he told her, "is to become one with the rifle. Don't think about the mechanics, just trust your instincts and let everything flow naturally." Sarah practiced visualization exercises, imagining herself at the competition facing down the seals. She pictured herself staying calm under pressure, trusting her training, and proving that skill could triumph over technology. The wooden rifle that had once belonged to her great-grandfather would be her weapon of choice, carrying the wisdom of generations of marksmen. As the weeks passed, Sarah's confidence grew. She wasn't just planning to attend the competition anymore, she was preparing to make a statement. She would show everyone that true marksmanship came from the heart and mind, not from expensive equipment and computer-assisted targeting systems. The day of the competition was approaching fast, and Sarah knew her life was about to change forever. She had no idea that her simple question, "Can I give it a shot?" would lead to one of the most remarkable shooting demonstrations anyone had ever witnessed. All she knew was that she had to try, for herself, and for everyone who believed that tradition and skill still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by technology. The morning of the Colorado Mountain Shooting Championship arrived with crystal-clear skies and almost no wind. Sarah had driven through the night to reach the remote facility, her grandfather's Winchester secured in the truck beside her. She felt nervous energy coursing through her body, but underneath the anxiety was a deep sense of calm that came from months of preparation. The competition venue was impressive, a sprawling complex built into a mountain valley, with shooting ranges extending out to nearly 4,000 meters. Professional shooters from around the country had gathered, their expensive equipment glinting in the morning sun. Sarah felt out of place among the tactical gear and high-tech rifles, but she reminded herself why she was there. Near the registration tent, a crowd had gathered around a group of men in Navy uniforms. The SEALs had arrived early and were setting up their equipment for the demonstration. Sarah watched from a distance as they unpacked their custom rifles, sleek, modern weapons that looked more like spacecraft than traditional firearms. Each rifle was equipped with advanced optics, bipods, and computer-assisted targeting systems. Lieutenant Commander, the team leader, was explaining their equipment to fascinated onlookers. "This rifle system can calculate wind speed, atmospheric pressure, and target distance automatically," he said, pointing to various components. "The scope can track moving targets and adjust for environmental factors in real time. It's like having a ballistics computer built right into the weapon." The crowd murmured appreciatively as demonstrated the rifle's features. Sarah noticed how the other spectators looked at the SEALs with obvious admiration and respect. These were clearly men who had earned their reputations through years of dangerous missions and intensive training. "Our longest confirmed hit in combat was at 2,847 meters, continued. "But under perfect conditions like today, we can consistently engage targets out to 3,500 meters or more. The key is having the right equipment and trusting the technology." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she listened. The SEALs were talking about distances she had never attempted, using equipment that cost more than her entire college education. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. What was she thinking, challenging these professionals with an old wooden rifle? But then she remembered her grandfather's words about trusting her instincts. She thought about all the hours she had spent in the Montana mountains, learning to read the land and feel the wind. She had skills that couldn't be programmed into any computer. The formal competition began with several events for civilian shooters. Sarah registered and performed well in the preliminary rounds, but she was really waiting for the sealed demonstration. When it finally started, hundreds of people gathered to watch the elite soldiers showcase their abilities. The SEALs began with targets at 800 meters, hitting them consistently with casual confidence. They moved progressively to longer ranges, 1,200 meters, 1,800 meters, 2,400 meters. Each shot was preceded by careful calculations and technological adjustments. Their accuracy was undeniably impressive. At 2,800 meters, announced, we're pushing the absolute limits of what's possible with small arms fire. Very few people in the world can make shots at this distance. The SEAL sniper lined up his shot, consulted his digital display, made minute adjustments, and fired. The target, barely visible even through high-powered spotting scopes, showed a clean hit. The crowd erupted in applause. "That concludes our demonstration," said. "We'd be happy to answer any questions about our techniques or equipment." Several people raised their hands with technical questions. Sarah felt her heart pounding as she worked up the courage to speak. Finally, she raised her hand and called out, "Can I give it a shot?" The question hung in the air for a moment, looked puzzled, scanning the crowd until his eyes settled on Sarah. She stood out among the tactical gear-wearing spectators in her simple jeans and flannel shirt. "I'm sorry, miss, but this is military-grade equipment. It's not really suitable for civilian use," replied politely but dismissively. "I wasn't talking about using your rifle," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "I meant with my own weapon. I'd like to try for the same target you just hit." A murmur went through the crowd, looked confused, then slightly amused. "What kind of weapon are you talking about?" Sarah walked to her truck and returned carrying the Winchester. The rifle looked ancient compared to the military hardware surrounding it. Its wooden stock was dark with age and wear, the metal was unadorned, and it had only simple iron sights instead of any optical equipment. "This is a 1943 Winchester Model 70, Sarah said. "It belonged to my great-grandfather, then my grandfather, and now me. I'd like to try for your 2,800-meter target." The crowd fell completely silent, stared at the old rifle with obvious disbelief. "Miss, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but that's not possible. That rifle doesn't have the ballistic capability for extreme long-range shooting, and without proper optics you can't even see the target clearly." "I can see it well enough," Sarah replied calmly. "And I think the rifle is more capable than you realize. Would you be willing to let me try?" Other SEALs had gathered around now, drawn by the unusual conversation. Sergeant First Class Danny, a competitive shooter himself, stepped forward. "Ma'am, no disrespect, but we're talking about a shot that requires precise calculations and advanced equipment. That's a hunting rifle from World War II. "Actually," Sarah said, "it's a precision rifle that was used by military snipers in that war. The fundamentals of marksmanship haven't changed, even if the technology has." Found himself in an awkward position. The crowd was listening intently, and cameras from local news stations were recording everything. He couldn't simply refuse without looking arrogant, but he also couldn't imagine this civilian making a shot that challenged even his team. "The target is painted steel at 2,800 meters, he said finally. "It's 18 inches square, which makes it extremely difficult to hit even under ideal conditions. If you miss by even a few inches, you'll be off the target completely." "I understand," Sarah replied. "If I miss, I'll acknowledge that your equipment and training are superior, but if I hit it, I think it would prove that traditional marksmanship skills still have value." The challenge was impossible to refuse now. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, and someone had already started the event on social media. Looked at his team members who shrugged and nodded. What harm could it do to let her try and fail? "All right," said, "but I want it understood that this is just for fun. We're not really comparing military precision shooting with recreational target practice." Sarah smiled and nodded. "Understood, I just want to give it a shot." As word spread through the facility, more people gathered to watch. The event organizers quickly set up additional spotting scopes so spectators could observe the target. Sarah felt hundreds of eyes on her as she prepared for the most important shot of her life. She walked to the firing line and knelt down, studying the distant target through her own spotting scope. At 2,800 meters, it was barely a speck against the mountainside. She could feel the slight breeze on her face and noticed how the morning sun created subtle heat shimmer in the distance. The SEALs watched with professional interest as Sarah prepared her rifle. Unlike their systematic approach with digital calculations and computer assistance, she seemed to be working purely on instinct. She checked the wind by tossing a handful of grass into the air and watching how it drifted. She studied the terrain between her position and the target, looking for visual clues about air currents and atmospheric conditions. "No rangefinder?" asked. "No ballistic calculator?" "Don't need them," Sarah replied, settling into her shooting position. "My grandfather taught me to read the distance by studying the target and the landscape. The important thing is understanding how the bullet will behave in these specific conditions." Shook his head in amazement. This young woman was about to attempt one of the most difficult shots in precision shooting, using methods that belonged in a museum. He felt almost guilty about letting her embarrass herself in front of so many people. But as Sarah settled behind her rifle, something changed in her demeanor. The nervous energy disappeared, replaced by an intense focus that reminded of his most experienced snipers. Her breathing became deep and controlled, and her entire body seemed to relax into perfect shooting position. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the bullet's path through the air. She could feel the wind patterns, sense the atmospheric pressure, and imagine how gravity would pull the bullet down over the long distance. When she opened her eyes, she felt completely connected to her rifle and the target. The crowd fell silent as Sarah took aim. Through the simple iron sights of the old Winchester, the target was almost invisible, just a tiny dark spot against the brown mountainside. But Sarah had learned to trust her instincts, and something deep inside told her exactly where to aim. She controlled her breathing, let her heart rate slow, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and the bullet began its 3-second journey across the valley. Everyone waited, watching through spotting scopes and holding their breath. Then, impossibly, they saw it, the unmistakable splash of dust around the target, followed immediately by the metallic ring of the bullet striking steel. The target had been hit dead center. The silence lasted for several heartbeats before the crowd exploded in cheers and disbelief, stared through his spotting scope, unable to believe what he was seeing. The target clearly showed fresh impact, right in the center ring. "That's impossible," whispered. "Nobody makes that shot with iron sights." But Sarah wasn't finished yet. As the crowd continued to cheer, she looked up with a slight smile. "That was 2,800 meters, she said. "But I notice you have targets set up even further out. Mind if I try the one at 3,800? The challenge had just become something far more serious than anyone had expected. The atmosphere at the shooting range had completely transformed. What had started as a routine military demonstration had become something unprecedented. News of Sarah's successful 2,800-meter shot with an antique rifle spread rapidly through social media, and more spectators were arriving by the minute. Local news crews repositioned their cameras for better coverage of what was shaping up to be an extraordinary event. Lieutenant Commander found himself in uncharted territory. Never in his 15 years of military service had he encountered a civilian who could match his team's precision at extreme ranges, especially not with equipment that belonged in a museum. The 3,800-meter target Sarah was requesting to attempt had been set up for advanced military testing only. Even his team rarely attempted shots at that distance, except under perfect laboratory conditions. "Ma'am," said carefully, "I need you to understand what you're asking. At 3,800 meters, we're talking about a shot that pushes beyond the effective range of most sniper systems. The bullet will be in flight for over 4 seconds. Wind drift alone can throw off the shot by several feet, and that's with computer-calculated corrections." Sarah nodded, but her expression remained confident. "I understand the challenges. The bullet drop will be significant, and I'll need to account for the effect at that distance, but I'd still like to try." The mention of the effect, the subtle influence of Earth's rotation on long-range ballistics, surprised the SEALs. This wasn't casual knowledge that most civilian shooters possessed. realized he had seriously underestimated this young woman's understanding of precision shooting. Sergeant pulled aside. "Sir, maybe we should consider this more carefully. If she makes this shot, it's going to raise some serious questions about our methods and equipment. The media is already calling this a David versus Goliath story." Glanced at the growing crowd and the news cameras. "She got lucky once, Danny. Lightning doesn't strike twice. Let her try the impossible shot and miss. Then we can all go home and laugh about the civilian who thought she could outshoot Navy SEALs with a wooden rifle." But privately was beginning to have doubts. Sarah's first shot hadn't looked like luck. Her preparation had been methodical and confident, and her shooting form was textbook perfect. There was something about her approach that reminded him of the old-school snipers he had trained with early in his career, men who had learned their craft before the age of digital technology. The 3,800-meter target was positioned on a distant, barely visible even with high-powered optics. It was an 18-inch steel square painted bright orange, the same size as the target Sarah had already hit, but at an almost impossible distance. At that range, atmospheric conditions became critical factors that could not be ignored. Sarah spent several minutes studying the terrain and environmental conditions. She watched the grass and vegetation at various distances, noting how the wind patterns changed across the valley. She observed the heat shimmer rising from sun-warmed rocks and soil, which would affect the bullet's path. Most importantly, she was calculating the complex ballistics in her head, using knowledge gained from years of shooting in Montana's challenging mountain conditions. "The wind is variable," she said to herself, loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "Light breeze from the northwest at the firing line, but I can see stronger crosswinds about halfway to the target. The bullet will need to be aimed significantly left to compensate." Captain James, the team's senior ballistics expert, was listening carefully to Sarah's observations. He had been quietly running calculations on his military-grade ballistics computer, and her assessment matched his digital predictions almost exactly. This civilian was demonstrating an intuitive understanding of long-range shooting that usually took years of specialized training to develop. "How do you know all this?" asked. "Did you have military training?" Sarah shook her head. "My grandfather taught me. He learned to shoot in Vietnam, where they didn't have computers to do the thinking for them. He said the key was to become so familiar with your rifle that you could predict how it would behave under any conditions." As Sarah prepared for the shot, her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "The rifle is just a tool, Sarah. The real weapon is your mind." She had internalized those words over years of practice, learning to trust her instincts and feel the connection between herself, her weapon, and the target. The crowd had grown to over 300 people, including shooting enthusiasts who had driven hours after seeing the online. The betting among spectators was running heavily against Sarah. Even those who had witnessed her first successful shot found it difficult to believe she could repeat the performance at an even more challenging distance. Made one final attempt to manage expectations. "Miss, I want to be clear about something. We've attempted this shot ourselves only a few times, and our success rate is maybe 30% even with our best equipment and ideal conditions. What you're attempting would be considered an exceptional shot, even for an experienced military sniper." "I appreciate that," Sarah replied, "but I've come this far and I'd like to see what's possible." She took her position at the firing line and began her final preparations. The old Winchester felt familiar and comfortable in her hands, like an extension of her own body. She had fired thousands of rounds through this rifle over the years, learning every subtle characteristic of its behavior. She knew exactly how it recoiled, how the trigger felt, and how the barrel responded to temperature changes. Through the iron sights, the 3,800-meter target was completely invisible. Sarah was aiming at a section of mountainside that looked identical to everything around it. But she had memorized the target's position using landmarks and terrain features, creating a mental map that would guide her shot. The mathematics of the shot were staggering. The bullet would drop over 40 feet during its flight and drift several feet sideways due to wind and effects. Sarah had to aim at a point in space that seemed to have no relation to where the target actually sat. But her calculations felt right, based on years of experience and instinctive understanding of ballistics. As Sarah controlled her breathing and prepared to fire, the crowd fell completely silent. Even the SEALs watched with intense interest, curious to see how this extraordinary challenge would resolve. The moment felt surreal, a young civilian with an antique rifle attempting a shot that represented the absolute pinnacle of precision marksmanship. Sarah's finger slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley, and the bullet began its long journey toward the distant target. For over 4 seconds, everyone waited and watched, knowing that the slightest miscalculation would send the bullet harmlessly into the mountainside. Then incredibly they heard it, the distant metallic clang of bullets striking steel. The sound carried clearly across the valley, unmistakable and definitive. Through spotting scopes, observers could see fresh impact marks on the orange target. Sarah had done the impossible. The crowd erupted in chaos. Cheers, applause, and shouts of disbelief filled the air as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. News cameras captured the moment when military precision met traditional marksmanship and lost. Social media exploded with videos and commentary about the civilian who had outshot Navy SEALs with a World War II rifle. Stared through his spotting scope in complete silence. The target clearly showed a fresh bullet hole, slightly off-center but undeniably a hit. After a long moment, he lowered the scope and looked at Sarah with new respect. "That," he said quietly, "was one hell of a shot." Sarah smiled and saved her rifle. "Thank you. It felt right from the moment I squeezed the trigger." Shook his head in amazement. "I've been shooting competitively for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. How did you learn to calculate all those variables without computers?" "Practice," Sarah replied simply, "and understanding that the technology is just supposed to help you do what you can already do naturally. My grandfather always said that if you need a computer to tell you where to aim, you're not really shooting, you're just operating a machine." The implications of Sarah's demonstration spread far beyond the immediate spectators. Within hours, videos of her shots were being analyzed by military trainers, competitive shooters, and ballistics experts around the world. The young woman with the wooden rifle had proven that traditional marksmanship skills, developed through dedication and practice, could still compete with the most advanced technology. For Sarah, the moment represented the culmination of everything her grandfather had taught her. She had honored his memory and validated the old-school methods that had been passed down through generations of marksmen. The antique Winchester had proven that craftsmanship and skill could triumph over technology and equipment. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the excitement began to fade, approached Sarah one final time. "Miss, I owe you an apology. I underestimated your abilities and the value of traditional training methods. Would you be interested in sharing your techniques with our training programs?" Sarah considered the offer carefully. "I'd be honored to help, but only if you're willing to learn that the most important equipment a sniper carries is between his ears. Technology should enhance natural ability, not replace it." Nodded, finally understanding the lesson that Sarah and her grandfather had tried to teach. The day that had started as a routine demonstration had become a powerful reminder that in the hands of a truly skilled marksman, even the simplest tools could achieve extraordinary results. The story of Sarah's impossible shots would be told and retold for years to come, inspiring a new generation of shooters to focus on developing fundamental skills rather than relying solely on technological advantages. Her simple question, "Can I give it a shot?" had challenged everyone's assumptions about what was possible and proven that sometimes the old ways were still the best ways.